Hey folks, George here again. Today when we talk about philosophy of law, we're going to really analyze the question, how do we know what the law is? Or rather, how do we understand the law? How are we supposed to interpret the law, especially the law that's written down? Because for a lot of thinkers, it's not entirely clear what's written down. And that's what a lot of debate and legal debate is. What does this law really mean? Yes? We're going to analyze two thinkers on these sorts of questions. The first that we'll talk about right now is Antonin Scalia, the late Antonin Scalia, who was a Supreme Court justice in the United States. And what Antonin Scalia is going to ask us is, what are we looking for when we interpret a law? What is it that we're looking at when we interpret the law? He sees that there's two possible answers to this question, right? Two possible answers. One possible answer is we should look at what the legislators who wrote the law, what did they intend when they wrote down the law? But here's Antonin Scalia's problem with that first position, that we should look at what the legislators intended when writing down the law. Why should we look at what they intended instead of actually looking at what they wrote down right in front of us? They wrote a law. Why not focus on that? And of course, that's what Antonin Scalia is going to suggest, that we should interpret the laws as they're written down. Now, we're going to visit next time a contrary philosopher named Ronald Dworkin, whom we've already visited in this series of discussions. And Ronald Dworkin is going to suggest that we should interpret laws so that they are consistent with principles and other previous laws. However, Antonin Scalia is who we're visiting today, and what he's really going to stress is that we should always follow what's written down. What's written down, that's what the law really is. And if you want to know what the law is and what the law means, and if you want to understand the law, you should understand what's written down. Antonin Scalia's idea is that to go against that idea and focus on something like intent, right? To focus on the legislator's intent actually goes against democracy. It actually goes against democracy. Why? Because legislators are the ones who were voted into office to write laws. However, judges are appointed, not democratically elected. And as such, we should listen to the democratic voice, not what some appointed judge thinks that the democratic legislators wrote down. And furthermore, to listen to one judge instead of the legislative body is tyrannical and goes absolutely against democracy. It's putting all your hands in one judge or a handful of judges, a handful of non-elected judges instead of elected legislative bodies. Scalia will acknowledge Congress can write foolish laws. That's their prerogative. Sometimes they make mistakes and write bad laws. But it's not up to judges to rewrite foolish laws, Scalia says. That's, again, what legislators are for. Legislators, when they recognize that some law is foolish, should rewrite the law or strike a law down and replace it with another law. That's the democratic process. And that's what Scalia is really going to put forward, is that this should be done in a democratic way. However, to allow a judge to change a foolish law is anathema to the notion of democracy. Judges are not there to write new laws or make old laws better. That's not their job. That's the legislator's job, right? The text that is written down, that's the law. And that's what must be observed, right? And of course, if you don't like the text that's written down, the legislative body, we should vote in legislators to change the written law. So Scalia says, don't depend on judges to change the law. It's not their job. And we could really sum up Scalia's position here with one word that he would even subscribe to, is textualism. Look at the text. Look at the text, and that's how we figure out what a law means, or what a law says, or how we know what the law is. Merely look at the text. Yes? And again, It's not the position of judges to make or write new laws, right? Rather, they look at the text and work with the text. Scalia gives us an interesting idea about how we look at the text of a law with this very interesting case, whereby the defendant used a gun, excuse me, I don't want to use that word, had a gun during a drug deal. And what the drug was, I don't want to use, because here's the point, and here's where you'll see the challenge here, is because the law says if you use a firearm, as part of a drug deal, right, then you are committing an extra crime. Dealing drugs is illegal, but there's an additional crime that says dealing drugs while using a firearm. And in this particular case that Scalia brings up, the firearm was, I don't know how to use the word use because that's the key problem here, but it was traded as part of the deal, right? Here's a firearm. Now give me some drugs. Here's some money. Please give me some drugs. Oh, by the way, here's a firearm too. Please give me some more drugs. So it was the mode of bartering, or perhaps the medium of bartering, in the same way that money is utilized. Again, you see how tricky it is sometimes for philosophers to not utilize certain words. So Scalia is asking, should that defendant be brought up with an additional crime of using a firearm in a drug deal? Now, Scalia's argument in discussing this case is to say, let's look at the text. The text says it's illegal to use a firearm. We all know what use a firearm means, according to Scalia. He says it means either fire a firearm or threaten to fire a firearm. And to use a firearm as a mode of trade, as a medium of trade, in the same way that we use money, that's not using a firearm. So clearly, use a firearm is not intended to be, we should not interpret the law that way. So that's how we should understand this law. Obviously, use a firearm means either use the firearm and fire the firearm, or threaten to fire the firearm, right? And of course, the court disagreed with Scalia here. And Scalia says this was a terrible, terrible mistake, because everybody knows what use a firearm means. This is ridiculous. He gives an analogy. He says, what if somebody asks you, okay, now I'm George here, and there's a cane, a walking stick, a walking cane, and I have it on my wall as decoration. And if somebody asks me, do you use a cane? Of course I shouldn't say, yes, I use a cane. Because when people ask, do you use a cane? What they really mean is, do you use a cane to walk? And do I walk with a cane, for example? And to interpret it as meaning, oh, I use a cane as decoration. Well, nobody uses the language that way. And that's just absurd. Now, this is George talking now. I don't understand what Scalia is trying to say here. I really don't follow the argument. I do think that if I have a cane on my wall and somebody says, do you use a cane? It's not meaningless if I say, well, I use a cane as decoration on my wall. This is just George talking now, right? Clearly Scalia will disagree with me, but it seems like using a cane I'm still using a cane, but it's as decoration. What's wrong with saying that? Scalia seems to have a problem with that, so it's difficult for me to follow Scalia all the way here. How might he respond? And by the way, in the same way, it seems like using a gun as a mode of exchange, like money, is using that firearm nonetheless. So I'm not clear on what Scalia is going for here. However, I would assume, and this is, I'm trying to be a little bit charitable to Scalia here. I would assume that he's saying, hey, fine, we could disagree about what use a cane means, or what use a firearm means. We can disagree with that. However, how are we disagreeing with this? We're not trying to change the law. We are looking at what the law says. The law really says use a firearm if you use a firearm during a drug deal. And as long as we're debating about what's written down, that seems like a reasonable debate, right, to Scalia. I hope I'm being charitable to Scalia here, and that's how I'm trying to understand and make sense of Scalia. At least this is a reasonable way to debate these sorts of questions, as opposed to certain schools, and you might have heard this, little kids' schools, I mean elementary schools, children's schools, that have rules against bringing guns to school. And a child was suspended, even doing this with his fingers. Did that child bring a gun to school if they're doing this? That seems radically different. That seems like a radical interpretation of the word gun, right? So I'm not quite sure how I think that's what Scalia means to say, right? Is as long as we're talking about the text that's written down, we're having a reasonable debate. I hope that's what he means, because I do disagree with him here, and Ronald Dworkin will as well, regarding what use a gun may or may not mean. The word is use a gun. I'm not sure. Scalia, now let's come back to Scalia for a second. Some will say, and Scalia addresses this challenge that he hears from people that say, you are too formalistic. Judges can't merely look at the words that are written down. That's too much formality. And Scalia's response to that is, you're darn right this is formality. You're darn right I'm focusing on formalisms. The rule of law is about form. That's what the rule of law is. Otherwise, we're exercising the rule of man, right? The rule of a dictator. And we can't do that. The rule of law is about following the formal rules. And yes, if the rules say follow the law that's written down, that's what Scalia suggests. And judges are not to write laws. Judges are merely there to interpret the application of laws. Scalia wears that as a badge of honor. He gives an example. Even if we get on video camera like this, right? Somebody murdering another person and then saying, by the way, staring into the video camera, I murdered this person, I'm of sound mind. I did this with intent, I've planned to do this for a long time. And we've got this on camera. What do we do with such a defendant? We still go through the formal process of putting that person on trial. We don't just assume that the person is guilty, even though we've got it on film, we've got the fingerprints, we've got, let's assume, eyewitnesses and everything like that. We still go through the formal process of a trial, because that's what rule of law requires, that we go through these forms and structures and procedures that are dictated by the rule of law. And that is what distinguishes rule of law from rule of dictator or rule of man, right? He also examines this notion of freedom of speech or the press. In the First Amendment, there is clearly freedom of speech and the press. Obviously, Scalia says, obviously what that means is we can extend that to all sorts of other range of communicative expression, including flag burning, presumably, right? Flag burning is not speech like this, and it's not something that typically is done by the press, by the media. However, Scalia would say this is a range of communicative expression, and thus it shall be protected, or other sorts of arts, let's say music, and other things like this. Scalia would say that's clearly what's written down. Scalia also likes having an originalist interpretation of laws. That is, what did the law as written down originally mean when the legislators wrote it down originally? This is contrasted, and Scalia contrasts his own position with something called the living Constitution position, such that the Constitution must live and evolve with the times, right? Scalia is against this idea. Number one, Scalia says that the living constitution idea is undemocratic. Right? If we want the Constitution to change, there is a way to change the Constitution through a democratic legislature. Right? The legislators shall be elected democratically, and they shall change the Constitution as we see fit. And to merely say, oh my goodness, the Constitution should change because times have changed, Scalia would be absolutely against such a thing. So for example, this is my example that I'm giving, is the Second Amendment. Clearly, the Constitution and the Second Amendment says there is a right to bear arms. So clear. Scalia would say that is what's written originally. What the original writers meant by that is that people shall have the right to bear arms. Now some people say, yeah, but society has changed. We don't live in a society like in 1776 anymore, in early American history. And thus, shouldn't the Constitution change? Scalia would say, perhaps the Constitution should change, but there's a process for doing that. The legislator shall change that, right? We shall elect people to change the Second Amendment. But we can't change it just by saying, oh, society has changed, the Constitution, our interpretation of the Constitution shall change with it. Scalia is against that idea. There is a proper way to change the meaning of the Constitution. He gives another example of this living Constitution, a decision that he disagrees with. The Sixth Amendment of the Constitution clearly states that a defendant has a right to confront the accuser in trial. There's no doubt what this means. What it means is that the defendant can cross-examine the accuser in a court trial. The living Constitution theory changed that idea, right, against Scalia's wishes, and have changed that such that children don't have to be cross-examined because this is too traumatic for children, let's say. And Scalia is against that idea. After all, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is there to give rights to defendants, right? When you are accused of a crime, you have certain liberties and you have certain limitations that you can impose on your prosecution. Now, the living Constitution folks have won that case and said, well, sometimes a child doesn't have to stand and be cross-examined by a defendant because it might be too traumatic or something like that. Scalia says this is terrible. That's a terrible decision. It's clear what the original Constitution meant. We should have maintained that. If you want to change the Constitution, change the Constitution. But do it in the proper way, not through judicial activism, so to speak, right? There's no living Constitution. This is, of course, changing the law by one dictator called a judge. And Scalia is against this notion. The other problem that Scalia has with this living Constitution theory is that it has no guiding principle. At least his own theory of textualism and originalism is, here's what we should do to decide a law. What's written down? Look at what's written down. And that's what we shall do. Whereas these living Constitution folks, Scalia suggests, have no guiding principle. Right? The law, the Sixth Amendment, for example, clearly says a defendant shall have a right to cross-examine the accuser. How do you change that? What is the guiding principle that led people to change that? Well, some people will say, yeah, but now we understand about psychology more. So psychology shall be the law now? Scalia would not like that at all. The law is what's written down. Or some judge's ethical beliefs or some judge's religious beliefs shall guide what the living Constitution has evolved to. Again, Scalia would be against such a claim, right? There is no guiding principle under this living Constitution idea. You can just pick and choose whatever guiding principle you want to change the law and interpret the law however you choose, and that is no law at all. The main problem here is that what has been done is that certain liberties are taken away from people. Certain liberties are taken away from people in a very undemocratic way by one judge. And those are really the arguments and reasons that Scalia supports his textualism and his originalism, because it's what's written down right there. what else is there? We need to follow rule of law. We need to follow democracy. And those are Scalia's main key ideas there. Yeah. See you next time. Bye-bye.